Edward, Duke of Windsor, was a man who has obsessed historians and journalists for decades. As King Edward VIII, he reigned for just 326 days before abdicating in disgrace. Best known for his affair and subsequent marriage to Wallis Simpson, history records him as one of the great romantics, a man who sacrificed his throne and prestige for love. As a couple, the Windsors dominated gossip columns and society parties, epitomizing a gilded existence for many adoring British subjects. Over 20 years after Edward's death, this idealized legend is still the authorized version. But the romantic headlines and romanticized biographies have concealed darker truths about Edward. Evidence has now emerged that he passed national secrets to foreign governments, of his complicity with Adolf Hitler, and of illegal financial dealings which netted him millions of pounds. The royal family and successive British governments have done everything to prevent this information about Edward being made public. Edward was born in 1894. The eldest son in a family of 6, his upbringing conformed to the strict discipline of Victorian conventions. An autocratic and remote father left him in the unhappy care of nannies and servants. In 1910, his parents became King and Queen of England. George V and Queen Mary granted Edward the title of the Prince of Wales. Throughout his life, Edward had an abiding love for all things German. The royal family's name, Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, reflected their German roots. His mother was a German princess, and the young prince spent many happy holidays there.
Edward had a natural sympathy with Germany. He'd been there as a young man. He had close friends and relations there. And it was his favorite language. I think it was the only foreign language that he spoke well.
The outbreak of war in 1914 threw the heir to the throne into crisis. Edward served in the Grenadier Guards, but was prohibited from fighting in the front line. It was a war between the two countries which formed his heritage. 20 years on, this conflict of loyalties would prove to be his undoing. After the war, Edward was used to promote the monarchy internationally. For most of the 20s, he toured the British Empire as a roving ambassador. Handsome and fashionable, the Prince of Wales was feted everywhere he went.
Everybody thought he was marvellous. He was good-looking. There appeared to be no sort of stain on his character or his performance at all. He'd done very well on the Western Front, everybody said. Everyone thought that he was going to be marvellous. It turned out not to be so, but then only the inner circle knew that it was likely not to turn out to be so.
But there was another side to the prince's character. He hated the stuffy rituals of monarchy and frequently dodged his duties to have affairs, usually with married women. None of these indiscretions was ever reported in the press, but his loyal retainers were expected to cover up for him, as they would throughout his life. His behavior infuriated his private secretary, Alan Lascelles, who wrote to his wife,
"I can't help thinking that the best thing that could happen to him and to the country would be for him to break his neck."
Relations between the two men broke down completely on a tour of Kenya. George V had fallen seriously ill. His life was at risk. But Edward refused to return to Britain. Lascelles wrote,
"Then for the first and only time in our association, I lost my temper with him. 'Sir,' I said, 'the King of England is dying, and if that means nothing to you, it means a great deal to us.' He looked at me without a word and spent the remainder of the evening in the successful seduction of Mrs. Barnes, wife of the local commissioner."
But Edward changed his philandering ways when he met Wallis Simpson, an American divorcee. In the early 1930s, they fell madly in love. Outspoken and ambitious, she represented the opposite of everything Edward had been brought up with.
I have never known, in the course of a long life, one person so utterly possessed by another as he was by her. It wasn't domination, it was a form of possession. Yes, it was very, very remarkable. And she was, in my opinion, the great nanny of all time. She was a nanny.
For King George and his courtiers, she was unsuitable on every count. She was twice married and in the throes of a second divorce. She was American and deemed ignorant of court ways. The thought of a divorced foreigner as queen was too terrible to contemplate. But more pressing matters were at hand. In 1933, Hitler's Nazi party swept to power on a platform of radical social reform. Edward greatly admired Hitler's programs to counter mass unemployment. He believed that Hitler had worked an economic miracle pulling Germany out of the Great Depression and stated publicly that Britain should offer them the hand of friendship. His father, George V, was furious. He accused Edward of unconstitutional behavior by intervening in foreign affairs and making pro-German statements.
When Hitler came to power, he approved of Hitler. He was, I'm afraid, a natural fascist. He was the sort of person who thought it was all right if the trains ran on time. And I think he was heard to refer to his own country, and probably France, as slipshod democracies, which shows where his sympathies lay, I think.
London is hushed, and all over the world, countless millions are waiting to take part in spirit in the last journey of His Majesty King George V, away from the crowds and turmoil of his capital.
In January 1936, George V died, and Edward succeeded to the throne. The wayward prince was to become a wayward monarch. Before he died, his father had predicted to Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin,
After I am dead, the boy will ruin himself within 12 months.
even at the proclamation of Edward as king, he seemed determined to tear up the rule book. He defied protocol and watched part of the ceremony with his mistress by his side. He soon gathered a new breed of courtier around him. Among them was his cousin, Charles, Duke of Saxe-Coburg. An old Etonian and a senior Nazi officer, he caused outrage at the king's funeral by wearing his Nazi uniform. Even before George V had died, Saxe-Coburg had introduced himself as Hitler's emissary and stated he would do everything possible to open up direct and private lines of communication between the new king and Hitler. Saxe-Coburg gave his impressions of Edward to Hitler in a secret message.
King Edward is resolved to concentrate the business of government on himself.
Saxe-Coburg went on to say that Edward wanted to talk in person to Hitler. The dangers of the king going behind his government's back were to become immediately apparent.